Hi again. Welcome to the second video in our discussion of Iris Marion Young's 5 Faces of Oppression. Now, the first of the 5 faces of oppression is exploitation. The concept of exploitation that Young uses comes from Marxist critiques of capitalism. She says that the mystery of capitalism is represented by the question, when everyone is formally free, how can there be class domination? The answer is that labor power produces surplus power. Labor power produces surplus value. You can think of surplus value as the difference between how much a worker is paid for their labor and how much money is made from the product of that labor. The capitalist is the one who profits from the surplus value of workers. A capitalist is someone who owns the means of production, someone able to supply the materials for workers to make what the capitalist wants to make. So, for instance, let's say that you whittled little statues of Abraham Lincoln from wood. Let's further say that the capitalist pays you, the worker, $5 for each statue you make, and is able to sell the statues for $20. The surplus value in this example is $15. The capitalist is exploiting you insofar as he is profiting from your labor, is paying you as little as possible for your labor, and is contributing nothing but the conditions under which you must work and make the statues. Now, one will want to argue that the capitalist is taking a risk, works hard, etc., and these are important points. But the point is that this little algorithm underlies what Marxists argue is the injustice of capitalist society, that some people exercise their capacities under the control and purposes of, for the control and purposes and for the benefit of other people. This systematically transfers the power of some people onto others, which raises the amount of power these other people have. For instance, women's oppression can be explained in terms of exploitation. Insofar as women transfer their maternal labor and their labor nurturing children and their sexual labor to men. Marx saw marriage as a class relation where women's labor benefits men without payment. Women are expected to provide emotional care for children and men. They're expected to provide sexual satisfaction for men. The norms of heterosexuality are oriented around male pleasure. For instance, think of those Viagra ads that you see on TV or on the internet. It's always the woman talking about how Viagra is going to increase the pleasure for a man. Where are the commercials for increasing women's pleasure in the sexual act? If you observe that men are the ones that society always tends to focus on in terms of sexual pleasure, then you're getting Young's point here. Even in the workplace, where women take feminine jobs, where the task is to smooth over workplace tensions, in some way or another enhancing the status of, please, or comforting others, usually men. Think of waitresses, clerical workers, nurses, and other caretakers. Take racism, a significant outcome of social structuring in terms of exploitation. In fancy hotels and restaurants that you might visit in different cities, the staff tend to be people of color or Hispanic. Menial labor is servile, unskilled, low-paying work, lacking autonomy, and tends to be racially specific exploitation. The second face of oppression is marginalization. Marginals, Young says, are people the system of labor cannot or will not use. So a shamefully large proportion of the population are marginalized, according to Young. Old people, young people, single mothers, mentally and physically disabled, etc. A whole category of people is expelled from social life. Moral agency and full citizenship require a person to be autonomous and independent. Groups that are marginalized do not have this moral agency. Or another way to say it is the ability to make one's own self-determining decisions about how to live one's life is denied to someone who is marginalized. The third face of oppression is powerlessness. The powerless are those who lack authority or power. The powerless must take orders and rarely have the right to give them. They have little or no work autonomy. By the way, autonomy is the ability to make one's own decisions. They exercise little creativity or judgment in their work. They tend to have no technical expertise and express themselves awkwardly. They have low social status and don't have the sense of self that professionals have. Professionals are those who acquire and practice a profession, which requires specialized knowledge. They are usually college educated and have day-to-day autonomy. They have privileges that extend to their whole way of life. They have respectability. Women and men of color must daily prove their respectability in that it is not assumed, like it often is for someone in the dominant group, rich white men. The powerless are not treated with initial respectful distance or deference, whereas working class white men are treated with respect until their status is revealed. The fourth face of oppression is cultural imperialism. Here we're talking about presence in the media and in the cultural products of society. The dominant cultural products express the experience, values, and goals and achievements of the dominant group. The dominant group's culture is depicted as representative of humanity. Oppressed groups are stereotyped in some way that is usually attached to their bodies. So gay people are promiscuous. Indians are alcoholics. Women are good with children. But the oppressed group's experience and interpretation of social life differs drastically from those of the dominant culture. The dominant group imposes their experience and interpretation on the oppressed groups through cultural imperialism. Finally, the fifth face of oppression is violence. The oppression of violence consists not only in direct victimization, but in the daily knowledge that all oppressed members share that they are liable to violations solely on account of their group identity. Just this threat deprives them of freedom and dignity. It expends needless energy. And since it is tolerated by society, it gains legitimacy. It was just a few years ago that I realized as a white man, I rarely am in fear of going to my car in a parking lot after dark. Yet every woman must confront this kind of fear all of her life. A gay man or woman has to live with a needless expending of energy in making extra plans when they walk down the street or when they go to a social event, because they always have to be aware that violence can be directed toward them at any time. And since it is tolerated on some level by society, it gains legitimacy. Young, toward the end of her article, applies these 5 criteria to different oppressed groups. Some groups have 1 or 2 faces of oppression. Some have more, some only 1. For instance, working class people are exploited and powerless, but not marginalized or undergo constant threats of violence as a group. Gay men are not exploited or powerless so much, but they experience cultural imperialism and live under constant threats of violence. Old people are marginalized and experience cultural imperialism. Women are exploited, powerless, and live in conditions of cultural imperialism and violence. While some of these particular ways of applying the criteria may be arguable, the existence of the criteria is a helpful method to determine if a group is oppressed without reducing all oppressions to a single scale. That's all for now. Thanks for your time and attention. And one more image for you. You're welcome.